Okay. Right, well, thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. It is late in the afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It was... I have talked at your branch many years ago. I can't even remember what I talked about, but it's always nice to come back to a branch again or a section. And as Mick alluded to there, I am genuinely delighted to be here. I'm actually genuinely delighted to be anywhere, given the fact that the first 3 people that came across me in Germany all started with the words, "We thought you was dead." So the fact that I am here talking to you tonight is a genuine pleasure for me. Tonight I'm going to talk about an incredible... The story of the BSA and Triumph triples is a strange story anyway. They were a bike that should never have existed. They were a bike that should never have been as successful on the racetracks as they were. And it's just a very strange story. But by far, the strangest chapter of the story of the BSA Triumph triples is the 4-cylinder triples. And I'm well aware that that is an oxymoron. I'm well aware that there is no such thing as a 4-cylinder triple. There are 3-cylinder triples and there are 4-cylinder 4s. However, as I go through the talk, you'll probably begin to understand why calling them 4-cylinder triples is probably the best description you can apply. Now, there are 3. Oh, and the man that's just come in is a very special guest indeed, because this is Mr. George Pooley himself who built this bike. There are 3 of these motorcycles in existence, and it's at this stage when I'm giving these talks, and this is probably about the 14th or 15th time I've given this talk over the last 4 months. It's at this time when I hold my breath and hope that nobody stands up and say, "Excuse me, I know of a 4th." Because if somebody does at that stage, my entire story and talk just collapses into a heap of embarrassment. But given that nobody has, I can carry on. There are 3 of these 4-cylinder motorcycles in existence. There is the Quadrent, the original factory 4. There is the Rocket 4, and there is the Quadrent. Now, I know my accent probably sounds funny to you guys anyway, but I don't normally go around. I don't normally go around saying Quadrant and Quadrent. But for the purposes of this talk, I will emphasise the A in Quadrant and the E in Quadrent, just so you know which bike I'm talking about. And the first of these bikes, the first of these 4-cylinder triples, is the original factory Quadrant. And the story of the Quadrant starts in around June 1974. Doug Heel went to the Isle of Man and came back, and in his words was very impressed by the racing 4-cylinder Yamahas. Now, one can only assume, after all this time, that one of the things he was very impressed by was the fact that the Japanese had now mastered the art of designing a 4-cylinder engine that didn't stick out at the sides. Because when BSA Triumph were looking at a multi-cylinder engine, and remember, the world had been brought up at this stage on a diet of vertical twins, very slim engines, but when BSA Triumphs were looking at a multi-cylinder engine, one of the reasons they didn't go for a 4 is they were scared of the width, hence they ended up with the triple. Honda then bought out the 4, Kawasaki bought out the 4, but then by 1974 Yamaha had managed to narrow how wide a 4-cylinder bike needed to be. And Doug Heel come back from the Isle of Man with these thoughts in his mind. Now, around the same time, Dennis Poor had been appointed the saviour, or the potential saviour, of the British motorcycle industry. NVT had been formed, and the Meriden co-op had gone off on its own merry way. And on one of the visits that Dennis Poor made to NVT Experimental, that was in Heath Green, commented to Doug Heel that, you know, Doug, what we could really do is we could really do is expanding our range of motorcycles. We've got the North Commando, we've got the Bonneville, we've got the Tiger, we've got the Trident. But what we really need is a 4. And as Dennis Poor walked out the door, Doug Heel got together a very small team comprising of Jack Shemmons, Alan Barrett and himself, and they set about trying to build a 4-cylinder engine. Now, this is how a Trident engine looks when it's split. I'm under a great deal of pressure now because George is here, sir. So, up until this time, the first 14 talks, I could have talked complete and utter bollocks, and no one would have known, whereas now George will know. And you know, I might add here as well that over the last few months I have become the world's leading expert on these 4-cylinder triples, but it's only because I know a little bit and everybody else knows jack shit. And in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. But this is what a Trident looks like when it's all split apart. And as much as the vertically split crankcases had been the scourge of the British motorcycle industry up until this stage, because vertically split crankcases equals eventually oil leaks, if you are trying to add a cylinder, a vertically split crankcase design suddenly becomes your friend. Because if you imagine you start with your centre crankcase section like that, there, so you have your centre crankcase section. If you want to add another cylinder, and I'm going to use the phrase, all you have to do is, very often during this talk, all you have to do is applies to incredibly skilled engineers, not an ex-accountant from a back country like me who can strip a spark plug changing it. But all you have to do to add another cylinder is put 2 of these centre crankcases together and build up then normal Trident on your drive side, normal Trident on your timing side. Very easy to a skilled engineer to create a set of crankcases. The crankshaft then provides the next problem, because the triples were renowned for the strength of the crankshafts. And one of the reasons why the crankshaft was so strong is the crankshaft was forged in one plane, and then there was a big machine at BSA that basically gripped one end of the crankshaft and gripped the other end and twisted it 120 degrees that way and 120 degrees that way, and you end up having a 120 3-cylinder crank. If you are trying to build a 4-cylinder engine in some secrecy, that then gives you a problem, because you can't just go to your machine and ask it to twist a 90 degree throw. Fortunately for BSA Triumph, the projects that the experimenters have been working on have consisted of a multitude of projects. One of them was looking at altering the firing throw, the crank throw of the triples. So instead of it being a 120 throw, it being a 180 throw, like the Meriden Jotas, 2 up and 1 down. And how they played around with the crank throws is, instead of having a one-piece crank, what they had is separate crank journals that they pressed together to give 180 throws or 180 throws like that. So when they wanted to create a 4-cylinder crankshaft, it was a relatively simple job to add another throw to these pressed together crankshafts. At that stage, you've then got your crankcases, you've got your crankshaft. The next bit's easy. The next bit, you get 2 cylinder blocks. You chop the left-hand cylinder off one, the right-hand cylinder off the other, you stick them together, weld them, and you have a 4-cylinder barrel. Your heads, you take 2 heads, you chop the left hand off the one side, the right hand off the other side, you then have your 2 heads. Same with your rocker boxes. Which only then leaves the problem of camshafts. And this is where Norman Hyde comes into the story, because Norman Hyde's father was a very skilled engineer. And Norman Hyde's father made up some 4-cylinder camshafts so that nobody in the factory knew that this 4-cylinder engine was being built. he actually made up 3 sets of these camshafts. One was a very mild very mild cam, and that's the one that originally eventually got fitted into the Quadrant. And the other 2 were normal Trident cam profiles. The next time Dennis Poole visited the experimental, he mentioned the 4-cylinder engine again to Doug Hill, and very dramatically Doug Hill whipped away a cover, and there was a 4-cylinder engine. So Dennis Poole's instructions was, okay, let's start testing it. Brilliant, just what we need. Let's start testing it. I'll get the accountants on it, working out whether we can afford to build it. You start testing it. And what they did is they put it into a frame that they were rolling chassis that they already had lying about. And this was an A75. An A75 is a BSA Lockheed 3. An A75 from 1972, which had previously been used to house an experimental overhead camshaft Trident. They put it into they used that rolling chassis to put the Quadrant engine in, and by early January 1975 they had effectively a mule to start testing. Now you can see, those of you that know A75s, from this side, this bike just looks like a 1972 Lockheed 3 home market, admittedly with a disc front end on, but it just looks like a normal Lockheed 3. There's very few records about the Quadrant experiment, and in a letter to the TR3OC, Doug Hill actually comments that very, very little was written down about them, and even fewer photographs was taken. This is a great photograph because it's in black and white and you can see a lot of detail. These are the only 2 colour photographs that I know of. They're 2 very poor Polaroid pictures, but they actually show the colour, which was the 1972 burgundy colour from the A75. And you can see this side, it just looks like a normal Trident, a normal Lockheed 3. But from the other side, you can see, probably it's blurred, but you can see that the right-hand cylinder effectively sticks out. And the reason the right-hand cylinder sticks out is because if you are using a rolling chassis designed for a triple, your determining factor where you can put the engine is always your final drive chain run. And so when you are building a 4-cylinder bike out of 3-cylinder parts and then using a 3-cylinder rolling chassis, you're always going to get an overhang to the right. And you can see clearly here, effectively that just looks like a normal triple, but of course you are dictated to by your chain line here as to where you can put it in the engine. Testing began in early January 1975, and by about the 20th or the 21st of January 1975, Dennis Poole came back and said the accountant said we can't build it profitably, scrub the idea. So the idea was scrubbed. Now that didn't stop normal company processes taking place, one of which was the fact that on the 28th of January, Alan Barrett sent an internal memo to Brent Price, who was the company secretary, to say that the bike needs to be re-registered from a 750 to a 1000 cc4. These days, of course, that would be done by an email, but back then we had internal memos. An interesting aspect of this, of course, is the actual engine number, because this bike was built from anything that got lying about. Now, GD 00171, that engine was originally in one of the TT Marshall's bikes. There was 4 Tridents and 1 BSA Lockheed 3 used as Marshall bikes, and 171 was the BSA Marshall's bike, and obviously they just raided the parts for the Quadrant. Now then something very interesting happened, because the project at this stage was shelved, it was dead in the water, but on the 4th of March, on the 6th of March 1975, for some reason the bike was taken to Myra Now, you can only assume that the reason it was taken to Myra is they was going to Myra to look at something else, and they've got space in the van, so they said, let's chuck it in and let's see what it can do. Because there's no other reason why it would go to Myra. However, the really interesting things are the test reports, because first of all, they've got no idea what to call it. Here they was calling it the BSA A75 4-cylinder. Secondly, they kept the revs down to 7,000 RPM. Now, a Trident, a good triple will rev to 8,000 any day of the week. A bad one will blow up at 8,000, but a decent one will rev to 8,000, 10,000. And so they were keeping the revs down on this bike to 7/8 of its maximum engine speed. And one assumes that that was because they were nervous about the press together crank. They were also using these low profile camshafts, and the cam profile that was in the original Quadrant was based on a cam profile they were looking at for the triples for the 1975 season, because they were very aware that they probably wouldn't pass the new American emission rules that was coming in 75 with the standard Trident cam profiles. And so they were looking at these soft cams, and when they put these soft cams into a triple, it reduced the brake horsepower from 58 to 51. So here you've got a bike that is being kept to 1,000 RPM below its maximum revs. It's using cam profiles that knock 12–13% off a regular Trident's power, and yet it was still hitting 127 and 126 miles an hour through the timing lights. Now that was well up with Kawasaki Z900 figures back then. It wasn't far off the Vertigo figures. And so it was crazy, the fact that this experiment that they built out of bits they'd got lying about, stuck in a chassis that wasn't really designed for, restricted the performance on the cams and the revs, still provided so much top speed. Now, does that mean it could have been produced and could have sold in 1975? Well, but of course it doesn't, because you couldn't have sold the Quadrant as it was in 1975, and it was probably a couple of years away from being developed into a satisfactory showroom product. And of course by then the Goldwing had come along. We wasn't that far away from the CBX and the Z1300, but it just shows this accidental massively fast bike that they produced. This is the only photograph of the Quadrant being ridden at the time. This is Neil Coombs, and Neil Coombs was the NVT factory test rider. Neil Coombs was the guy that rode it at Myra. And this picture was taken by Norman Hyde in the back lanes around the kids' green. And the only reason that this picture was taken was simply to show the 4 exhaust pipes. That's why he's cranked over. It was simply to show the 4 exhaust pipes, just due to posterity. Many years later, this is Neil Coombs as he looked a couple of years ago, reunited with the bike at the National Motorcycle Museum. And then the bike got back into storage. Various NVT companies were formed and crashed and formed and crashed, until eventually they sold off all the assets, the liquidator sold off all the assets, and Roy Richards bought the Quadrant for his fledgling National Motorcycle Museum. He gave it to Hughie Hancock's, the well-known Triumph restorer, with the instructions, don't do anything to the engine, but just put it into a sort of look that it might have been in the showrooms. And Hughie Hancock came up with this. Quite why it was badged as a Triumph when everything about the original factory Quadrant was Rocket 3 is probably due to the fact that 78, 79, when this was being done, Triumph was still in existence, BSA had long since gone, and so you assume that's why it was badged up as a Triumph rather than the BSA. This is when he hawked it round on various fundraising shows leading up to the opening of the National Motorcycle Museum. And of course, this is, as we know, the Quadrent today. These are the factory, these are the museum's press photographs that they do. And of course, there you can see this overhang on the right-hand side of the original Quadrant. The name Quadrant didn't actually appear anywhere until around the mid-80s, and Bob Curry tested the bike for the classic motorcycle. Bob Curry had already ridden the bike at the time. He was the only journalist to actually ride the bike at the time, but he actually tested it for the classic motorcycle, and that appears to be the first time the word Quadrant appears to describe this bike. And for 15, 16 years, it was the only four-cylinder motorcycle, four-cylinder triple in existence. And then in the mid to late 90s, a guy called John Anderson was a former BSA employee, decided he was going to build his Rocket 4. And this is his Rocket 4. Now, the Rocket 4 follows exactly the same build process as the Quadrant, and of course it's based around a Rocket 3, just like the Quadrant was based around a Rocket 3. And so you can see it is effectively a Quadrant rebadged as a BSA. Again, you can see the overhang of the cylinder here because he's trying to force a four-cylinder engine into a three-cylinder frame. There you can see from the drive side, it just looks like a normal Rocket 3. And of course, this is one of the peculiar things about the Quadrant and the Rocket 3 and the Rocket 4, is that from the one side, it just looks like a normal bike. As I've been doing these talks, it's been really interesting because every now and again somebody will stand up and they'll give a bit of a snippet about the story that I didn't know. And I was down at the West Wilts VMCC early January, and at the end of the talk, when we were doing a question and answer session, this guy stood up and he said, my friend was one of the factory workers at NVT that just had to put some miles on the original factory Quadrant before they tested it properly. And he said he went out one morning on it and called into a pub for lunch, and when he come out, the Quadrant had gone, it had been nicked. And he was trying to figure out what on earth he was going to say to the factory, you know, this prototype bike's been nicked. He went round the corner and there it was, leaning up against the wall, and one assumes that whoever stole it from this side, thinking it was just a triple, got on it, suddenly realised there was an extra cylinder, and realised that he hadn't got anything he could do with, and just propped up against the wall and went off. But this is the thing about the first two bikes, from the one side they just look like a BSA Rocket 3, but of course the Rocket 4 has this overhang just like the Quadrant. Again, you break out that cylinder, you just have a normal A75, and you can see more clearly here, it's just a normal A75, but you are always, if you are using a rolling chassis design for the 3, you're always limited by the drive chain going to the back wheel. The other thing, of course, if you have a sticky out bit on the right hand side, is your gear lever that normally points forward has to be reversed. So both the Quadrant and the Rocket 4 end up with a 1 up and 4 down as opposed to a 1 down and 4 up, like on a normal Trident. This picture is just to show you exactly the same as the original factory Quadrant. You have your 2 rocker boxes at the front and your 2 rocker boxes at the back. Each rocker box looking after 2 cylinders. Now, the Rocket 4 is a peculiar beastie because I've been around triples a long time and I've never heard the Rocket 4 run. I've never spoken to anybody that's heard the Rocket 4 run, but I have spoken to people who have spoken to people that have heard the Rocket 4 run. However, there is a real possibility that the Rocket 4 no longer exists because it was actually owned by John Anderson and another guy, and when John died, it became the subject of a very acrimonious argument who owned the Rocket 4, and I have been told that it has now been broken up and split. Whether that's true or whether it's not true, I don't know. What I do know though is this bike hasn't been seen in public since 2016 was the last time it was seen in public. So there is every possibility that this bike no longer exists. However, it did exist at one stage. The other thing about this bike is very little is known about the internal engine construction. The external engine construction has to follow just the normal process that the original bike, the original Quadrant followed. But it is believed that the crankshaft on the Rocket 4 was a modified car crankshaft, presumably something like out of an Austin 1000, something like that. That's how I believe the crankshaft was on the Rocket 4. Which brings us to the Quadrent. Now, the Quadrent was built by an extremely talented engineer, Mr. George Pooley, and it was the culmination of several false starts, but it actually appeared in the flesh in the early 2000s. This was the bike in its first incarnation. In every respect, the basics of the build of the engine are identical to the Quadrant and the Rocket 4. You stick in an extra centre crankcase section, you create a crankshaft, you put two-thirds of a cylinder block together, you put two-thirds of the cylinder head together, you put 4 rocker boxes together. But George wanted to do something slightly different. George wanted to build a motorcycle that actually looked like a motorcycle. Of course, George had this problem that the previous 2 builders had. How the hell do you build a 4-cylinder crankshaft? And of course, how George dealt with it is he bought an almighty big piece of metal and turned it down on a lathe until he got a 4-cylinder crankshaft. The rest of the engine was exactly the same as, apart from the fact it's left-hand gear change, but was exactly the same as the Quadrant and the Rocket 4. You put the two cylinders crankcase sections together. There's another part of the build. There's your empty crankcases. There's a nice shiny crankshaft and your empty crankcases waiting the crankshaft. And there's a crankshaft in the nice empty crankcases. And then this is where George went off on a tangent, because the previous 2 4-cylinder bikes, when they got to this stage, looked for a rolling chassis to plonk this engine in, and they both went for a triple rolling chassis, which creates this anomaly where your engine has to be offset. What George decided to do is he would build a rolling chassis for the 4-cylinder motor. I feel really weird talking about you and you sitting there. I will just point this out. And so what George did is he took a T120 frame loop, he put a modified T160 swinging arm in, and with some judicious spreading of the bottom rails and some mighty fine spacers in the rear wheel, managed to get an engine that sat relatively central in the frame. And of course what this means is that when you look at the front of George engine, you see a nice balanced 4-cylinder engine, exactly like you'd expect to see a 4-cylinder engine, as opposed to the factory Quadrant and the Rocket 4. And you can see just how much neater George's bike looks because the engine is centrally placed in the frame. Exactly the same as the previous 2 bikes. You have 4 separate rocker boxes. I took that picture because I've just been out on the bike in the rain and that probably was arcing terribly from that jump there, but it gave me an opportunity to take a picture of the rocker boxes so you can see the rocker boxes clearly. You'll obviously be able to have a good look at that afterwards. This is the rocker boxes from the other side, and you can see effectively there's two rocker boxes at the inlet, two rocker boxes at the exhaust. And of course the name Quadrent. Well, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, there is no such word as quadrant. There is quadrant, but there is no such word as quadrant. And clearly quadrant is a play on the word trident. And it's quite a nice word as well. The interesting thing, you know, when I say something's interesting, it's interesting to a rat like me, it probably bores the pants off you. But one of the interesting things I find about this word quadrant is it's not the first time a word has been made up to cope with a weird part of the triple story. And a previous time when it happened was when the racing threes, when the works triples first came out. And the works triples, they were the first race bikes to have what we now know as 3-into-1s. You know, we call them 3-into-1s, we call them 4-into-1s. But when the works triples were launched onto the public in 1970, nobody had ever seen these sort of exhaust systems on bikes. And so the press didn't know what to call them. Now, the press were aware that the sidecar guys back in the 60s very often put two exhausts into one, and they call them a Siamese system. So for the first 6 months of the racing triples lives, the press referred to 3-into-1s as Triamese because that was the only thing they could think. And of course, again, it doesn't exist, but it's a typical anomaly of the triple story, and it creates all of these problems for the press. And then this is where I come into this story, because last year at Beazle, I offered a cup of tea out of George's glass. And we're standing by the Quadrant. And to cut a long story short, we start asking ourselves, well, what actually is it? Is it a motorcycle, or is it an engineering folly? Is it just a, well, let's see if we can build it, rather than let's see if we can build a force of the motorcycle? And George, to his everlasting regret probably, said to me, well, take it and tell me what it is, tell me whether it is just a folly or whether I've built a working motorcycle. Because up until that moment, this bike had never ever covered much more than 80 miles in any one go. And so I thought about what I could do with it and how I could try to figure out what it was. And I thought, well, I could just ride it around the block. I could ride it many times around the block. That's not going to prove anything. Or I could perhaps take it on a long distance ride. What's the long distance ride could I do? Well, I know, everybody knows where John O'Groats is, everybody knows where Land's End is. Why don't I ride it? John goes to Land's End. And then of course, well, do I do it over a multitude of days? What's that going to prove? You can walk from John O'Groats to Land's End if you have enough time. And a few years ago, we rode an NBT easy ride over 5 days from one end to the other. So the project was, let's just do an end-to-end. John O'Groats to Land's End. So I picked the bike up off George, and we kind of set ourselves some rules here. And, you know, we didn't need to set ourselves rules, but the rules were, or the initial rules were, I'll just pick it up from you, George, and let's see what happens. So I picked it up from George, put it in the back of the van, found 2 people who was willing to meet me at John O'Groats, and then one ride down with me, one drive my van, and set up for John O'Groats. I got up there, this was last August time, stopped at the Seaview Hotel. Anybody that knows John O'Groats will know the Seaview Hotel is where you tend to stop up there. While I was waiting for my 2 companions, I jumped on the bike, I rode it down to the signpost for the obligatory picture. This was kind of the first time I'd really ridden the bike. I'd ridden it a few, 10 years earlier I guess, for a couple of miles around Caswell, but this was the first time I'd ever ridden a bike on the road. Bike went fine for a mile, absolutely brilliant. Took the picture. Thought I better just get some miles under my belt just so I can get a feel of it before I set out for Land's End the next day. And so I jumped back on the bike. Thurso is about 30 miles across the top of Scotland. Heading for Thurso, and for 10 miles it was a beautiful test drive. And then I looked down at my feet, and there was oil everywhere, absolutely everywhere. We got back to the Seaview Hotel, and despite my best efforts, it clearly wasn't going to be something we could fix on the side of the road. Basically, the gaskets had just gone on the rocker boxes, and it was chucking out oil left, right, and centre. I'd actually arranged to meet the people down at the National Motorcycle Museum the following day on my ride down, and I thought, well, there's no point in cancelling that. So I got up really early in the morning, I drove back home, unloaded the bike, and it was fine to ride it 30 miles down to the National Motorcycle Museum. And we arrived there, and the National Motorcycle Museum were kind enough to let us have the original Quadrent outside. Took loads of photographs, and I think this is a really interesting photograph because here you have like effectively a dressed up factory hack that was an engine shoved into a frame that was never designed, whereas George had built a motorcycle that was where the engine and the frame were made for one another, and it kind of shows when you look at the two bikes side by side. Here's a clear picture of them. The Quadrent looks so much more like a motorcycle than the Quadrent. Normally, at this point in time, I say, that's George Pooley, but of course you already know what George Pooley looks like, he's walking. But that's me explaining a few things to him about the leads. And we then decided, okay, we need plan B. So plan B was, I was going to keep the bike for a few weeks. I was just going to familiarise myself with it. I could cope with the leaks, that was no problem. And then I was going down to, I don't know, somewhere on the Trident, Slovenia or Slovakia, something like that. And so the plan was, I'd ride it for a couple of weeks, I'd then take it up to George, George would fix the leaks, and then by the time I come back from Slovakia, he'd be ready to attempt the run again. So for the next couple of 3 weeks, I rode it a lot. I used to get up in the morning, I do probably 100 miles a day on it. Put me gallon of petrol there because at this stage nobody knew how many miles it did per gallon. George has owned this bike for 20 years and he got no idea of the fuel consumption. I used to put my sandwiches and my notepads in there, and then off I'd go riding around. I went down to the Trident factory, the business centre. Nobody turned an eye at this bike. And of course, that is this bike's both biggest compliment and its biggest criticism, because it just doesn't look special. It just looks like a motorcycle. Now, I don't know whether that's a compliment, I don't know whether it's a criticism. Maybe if you're trying to build a special, it's a criticism. If you're trying to build a motorbike, it's a compliment. There was one particular instance that I filled up with petrol, on one of my many rides out that week. I filled up with petrol, and I was minding my own business, filling up. This guy comes up, turns up on a bike, sees me, comes walking over to me, and his opening word was, "I had one of these." I said, "No, you wouldn't have had one of these." He said, I did. I said, "No, you wouldn't." "I did, it's a T160. "No, it's not." "It is, it's a T160. And this guy's arguing with me that this bike's a T160, and I'm saying, "No, it's not." And it wasn't until I said, "Count the carburettors," that he actually realised that it wasn't a T160. I was at the Northumbrian VMCC doing a talk on this a few weeks ago, and this one guy came up to me at the end of the talk and said, "You know, I've seen this bike at Stafford so many times outside with the race bikes, with the racing triples." He says, "And I walked past it thinking, why is it a T160 parked amongst all this exotica?" And he said, "It's only when you've pointed out it's not a T160 that I realise it's not a T160. And as I say, that is its biggest criticism if you're building a special, or its biggest compliment if you're building a motorcycle. This is just, I live on Cannock Chase, and there's a place called the German Cemetery, and this was just an opportunity to take another picture. it was mainly because I was trying a multitude of seats on it just to see which was the most comfortable seat, and this was a single seat I got off a Cardinal, and I tried that for a day, but it wasn't any more comfortable than a standard seat. This, of course, is in Meriden. I understand that the last session of Parliament, they've now passed a law that if you are in Meriden on a Trident and you don't have your photograph taken by the memorial, it carries a mandatory 20 weeks in jail. So I've taken so many pictures of so many Triumphs next to that. And this is a really interesting picture because one day a guy called Scott Ingram from the TR3LC came round, and George had said to me, you can let people who you trust have a ride of the bike. And so we went out riding, and halfway around the ride we swapped bikes, so Scott could ride the Quadrent. But this one kind of changed. We just took a picture of the two bikes, and you can see how, at first glance, until you start counting exhaust pipes and carburettors, it's just a Trident at first glance. When you ride this bike, it's a very interesting bike to ride. It's because if you are familiar with Tridents, it feels so much like a Trident until it doesn't feel like a Trident. And again, it sounds so much like a Trident until it doesn't sound like a Trident. And so if we were to start it up now, everybody would say, oh, that sounds just like a Trident. And so what I did, I took some videos of what the Quadrent sounds like compared with the Trident. Now, my wife was the camera lady. I stood her in the island just by our house, and she took various shots. The first video you see is the Quadrent. The second video you see is a Trident. Some of you might have seen there was a big article on this in Real Classic a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, and Frank Westworth, when he rode it, his comment was, you're very aware that there's something very meaty spinning around in the crankcases. Here's a Quadrent again. Here's a Trident. And it isn't just the exhaust, no, the actual engine sounds much heavier with the Quadrent.
John, are you going to talk about the crankshaft layout on the Quadrent versus the Trident at all? Because if not, this sounds like a good time for either you or
Okay,
George
the way the Quadrent crankshaft is basically you have two up and two down in the middle. So two up there, two down in the middle. On a Trident you have one there, one there, and one here. So you have 120 throw on Trident. You have effectively two 180 throws on this, on the Quadrent. So I had the bike back off George. George had the bike, fixed the leaks on the top. I had the bike back and took a couple of runs, arranged to meet another couple of mugs up at John Oates who was going to accompany me down. This was a husband and wife, and they was going to go up on the bike, and the wife was going to drive my van, and Graham, the husband, was going to follow me on his bike. And we arranged to meet at John O'Groats. I took the bike one last quick run. I just did a 400-mile lap of the motorway, so up to Manchester, across to Leeds, down to London, across to Bristol and back up to Howell, just to make sure everything had settled down. And it had, and it was dry at the top, but it was now leaking at the bottom. But it wasn't leaking that much that it was going to stop the ride. Now, I've done Land's End to John O'Groats and John O'Groats to Land's End more times than I can remember. If anybody ever wants to do the run, I'll take groups. It's just a ride that I've done lots of times. But when you do the John O'Groats to Land's End run, you always do it in the summer because you want the long days. You want the good weather. You never do it at a weekend because you don't want the traffic. Which is why on a Friday morning in November, I found myself at John O'Groats about to try to ride down to Land's End. Sally was going to drive my van, Graham was going to follow me on his K1600 BMW, and it went great. We got down to Inverness, bang on time, filled up with petrol. That was the second fuel stop. And as we climbed out of Inverness up into the Highlands, it started to rain, and it was absolutely torrential rain. The worst rain I can remember for many years in England, in the UK. It was, I'll tell you how bad it was. We filled up with fuel at Pit Lockery, and as we were filling up with fuel at Pit Lockery, this guy came over from his car and actually said, "Are you mad riding in this weather?" It was coming down in steroids. The bike never missed a beat. It just purred through all this weather. Eventually, gale force winds blew the rain away, but by the time we got to Gretna, we were bang on to target. We had enough time to have a decent lunch, also enough time to take the obligatory border picture, and off we set again. And everything went perfectly well until we got to junction 36, when we hit 30 miles of stationary traffic all the way down to junction 32, and had to filter for 30 miles. Again, the Quadrant behaved itself impeccably. The BMW disgraced itself because we had to stop at junction at Fortin services at junction 32 because the BMW was overheating. But it gave us an opportunity to let Sally catch us up in the van. And at that stage we thought the ride was over because we thought we'd lost too much time. A quick calculation showed that we hadn't, and so off we set again with the understanding that if we got split again, I would just carry on, and eventually the BMW and the transporter van would catch me up. We hit all the rush hour traffic when we got to junction 14 at Stafford. We hit all the rush hour traffic. I was able to filter through most of it. The BMW was a bit lardy, so that got stuck, and the transporter van obviously got stuck. But I managed to get through it, and just as dusk was setting in, I got onto the M5. I got down to junction 4 on the M5, and cars started flashing me. And so I pulled over to the hard shoulder, and it was obvious what happened, that the tail light had stopped working. And given the fact that I knew that it was going to be raining again a little further down, I'd got no idea how far behind me the BMW was or the transporter was. I pulled into a service station at Bromsgrove and just decided to wait for them to arrive. And we'd done about 650 miles at this stage, and I was mightily pissed off that we hadn't done the ride, done what we set out to do. But actually, we had done what we set out to do, because actually what we were trying to figure out is this an engineering folly or is it a motorcycle? And you can't do 650 miles in 150 miles of torrential rain, 30 miles of filtering on the M6, and 650 miles in 15 hours on an engineering folly. You can only do that on a motorcycle. And so we had set out to prove that what George had built was a motorcycle. It wasn't an engineering folly. It was a motorcycle that consumed a lot of oil, didn't really consume it, it lost it rather than consumed it. We think, figured out why it's leaking, just simply through a lack of pressure relief on the right-hand crankcases. Going a bit off the subject of the ride here, the way the engine ends up is you have effectively 2/3 of a Trident engine on the drive side and 2/3 of a Trident engine on the timing side, but it only scavenges from the drive side. And I'm relatively certain that there's a build-up of pressure in the right-hand part of the engine that can't scavenge properly. The reason I'm relatively certain of that is you'll see that I've stuck a breather on there, and when we stuck the breather on and then put the end into a jar of water, the amount of bubbles that was coming out suggests it's just pressure. I understand George is going to have to strip the engine down over next winter, and I suspect that hollowing out the crankcase a little bit more and perhaps increasing the scavenge rate, because the Quadrent, the factory Quadrent, used a bigger capacity oil pump that could pump oil out quicker. And I think that's all this is. It's not a major thing. It just needs tweaking a bit. But it didn't burn oil. When you're following it, it's not smoking. It does between 36 and 42 to the gallon, depending on how you ride it, which is actually just normal Trident fuel consumption. It has, I think it has a peculiar handling trait, but I suspect the reason I notice it is because I ride Trident so much. And this handling trait is when you're sitting on this bike, it feels so Trident-like. You have to remember that you're not riding a Trident. But it's very difficult to remember that because it just feels like a Trident. And so when you go into a bend, what I notice is for the first part of a bend, and it's right or left, it handles just like a Trident. And then there is a moment, a split second, where the weight of the engine just nudges you to the right or nudges you to the left. And then it behaves like a Trident again. Now I suspect that if you didn't ride a Trident as much as I do, you probably wouldn't even notice it. It's just that I notice it because I ride a Trident, and I can't remember when I'm riding this that I'm not riding a Trident. So I look for Trident capabilities, and there's just this odd thing that is different from it. Anyway, we got home that night, and although I put a brave face on Facebook, and I said, no, well, we've set out to achieve what we wanted to, and we've done everything we wanted to. I was mad as hell. Many years ago, one of my business adversaries referred to me as a single-minded bastard. He meant it as an insult, I took it as a compliment. And I sat there secretly fuming about the fact that we hadn't got down to Land's End on that one day. And so a couple of days after we failed at Bromsgrove, I convinced yet another mug, to meet me at my house at 4 o'clock on the Thursday morning. We loaded the Quadrant into the back of the van. We drove down to the petrol station where we ended the previous Friday, unloaded the Quadrant and rode down to Land's End. It lashed down with rain for 210 of the 250 miles. Absolutely shut it down. We rode through Bristol in the dry, but 5 hours after leaving we arrived at Land's End, and so the bike had actually completed a John Goes to Land's End in 21 hours. That isn't that much longer than I would do it. On my Trident, I would do it in about 17, 18 hours. On my Explorer, I do it a lot faster than that. But on the Trident, I do it in 17, 18 hours. So even though we had all that bad weather, we had all that bad traffic, the Quadrant was only 2 or 3 hours slower than my Trident, and my Trident's a pretty trick bike. And of course, it just further proved that this is a fully functional, fully working motorcycle, and seriously, not that I'm hankering here for another ride on it, but if George says take it a really good run, I don't know, probably take it to Europe, travelling all over Europe on it. I've got that much confidence in this bike. It is a decent motorcycle. And then there's this QR4OC. Clearly, if you have a motorcycle, and if you have a motorcycle club dedicated to the Trident and Rocket 3 Owners Club, the Trident and Rocket 3s, you call it the Trident and Rocket 3 Owners Club, the TR3OC. And so if there was a club for the 4-cylinder bikes, it would be the QR4OC. And the reason I mention this is because George has already got his Quadrent, and he's now working on his Rocket 4. These are the embryonic crankcases that I noticed on one of his wheelie bins when I was over at his house one day. I took this picture as much really so you can clearly see the two centre crankcases, the two barrels, the two heads, the four rocker boxes, and this is just to show that it actually is a Rocket 3 as a Rocket 4 as opposed to a Trident because it's got the Rocket 4 timing cover on. And then this is where I put this slide up. And every time I put this slide up when I do this talk, I put this slide up with huge apprehension because, as I say, although I am the world's leading expert on these bikes, that's because I know that much and everybody else knows that much. So please feel free to ask questions. George can probably answer more of them than I can on the technical side. Feel free to sit on it, have your pictures taken. There is one thing that I want to say before we start the questions, and that's my bucket. I do talks all over the country. I think this is already my 15th talk this year. And I never ask for expenses, I never ask for fees, but what I do ask for is to bring my bucket, because over a number of years, myself and Sonia, my wife, we've been collecting for a local children's hospice quite close to where we live, the Donna Louise Trust. It's actually been rebranded this year to the Dougie Mack Hospice, but it's still the Donna Louise Trust. The Donna Louise Trust looks after terminal children. And as I say every time I do these talks, I've been lucky. I've had 2 children, they've grown up to be fit and healthy. When I go to the hospice for photo shoots and the like, for the check handover, and you see these kiddies, I have no idea how the parents of these children possibly cope with the fact that they're taking their children there and they're going to watch them die. We therefore try to collect money for them. Over the years we've collected a fair bit, but anything you can give is always welcome. And as I always say, if you have enjoyed the talk, please put a few coppers in the bucket. If you haven't enjoyed the talk, put notes in there, and I promise I will never come back. And feel free to ask any questions.
Okay, I've got one. Go.
Oh, sorry. Ignition.
Ignition is a boiler for a twin with 2 extra magnets on. Is that right, George, isn't it? Yeah.
Is that double-ended coil or 4 coils?
There's 2 twin lead coils.
Double-ended.
Yeah. Is that what they are? Yeah.
And you made that up yourself, George?
My brother.
Made it the what?
The ignition. You
Oh, me and my brother, well, at one time when it was silver, when I first did it, we had a lot of trouble with the ignition light. And you know of Tri-Spark, don't you?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was that bad because you could rev it as much as you wanted it on the drive light, but you go on the road, it'd break down under power. It was just banging all sorts. And we had a lot of trouble with it. And we even tried, I had an old crankcase, timing cover, I welded a housing on it and drove the boiler off the crankshaft. See if that'd make any difference. No, it didn't make any difference. But I went round Cadwell Park when Tri-Spark was there. What's his name?
Steve Kelly.
Yeah. And he says, well, I'll do you one light. I mean, I went around the track all the time, it was missing at certain points and things, and all right. In the meantime, me and my brother eventually got to this, how it is now. But he says, well, I'll make you one up, and I thought, yeah, how much is that going to cost? And I had a Tri-Spark on my hurricane when I went to Duxford with, I can't remember his name now. So I went to Duxford, got back, and we were going to the Triumph Owners Club at Callum in Newark, and it wouldn't start. We'd only been on it, we both had them fitted at Cadwell. me and my mate Dave on his gun, he was all right. He held the pistol before he got to Newark on the way back. Anyway, and that one packed in, but who was in right down south? No, I'm trying to think who was fitting them in Cadwell. But anyway, I got me 55 quid back, I sold it straight away and went back on boil, like, and never had no trouble. But, so I just stuck with boy. We've done the end stuff with boys, split them up. In fact, well, I'll not go too much. Not go too much. But anyway, do you want us to have a quick half an hour here? Well, I bore you if I tell you how this started.
No, go for it.
I'll face it. I'm getting eight. But what happened was, when I first got the idea for the Quadrant, I got a twin engine Bonneville, 1500 side by side. And I had a ride up the street on that long ago. I live up in a cul-de-sac on the hill. And I thought, wow, power in this. I thought, I wonder what the factory Quadrant would be like. So I started doing it then. This is 1990, we got the 1500 body running. And it was about 91 where I started looking to have crankshafts made. Because I was going to do a rocket 4 with a Quadrant. So I went to Staveley near Sheffield and had a wooden pattern made. That cost £550. I then had 2 crankshafts cast. That was another £100 each for the cranks. It just looked like a crankshaft, but they just wanted machining off like that. So I managed to find somebody who would turn the crankshaft. I searched all over the place, gun places, and right, and I got Trevitt Workshop, and he says, right, we'll do it. So he turned them, don't forget there was 2, and then he rung me one day, and he says, I need some money up front. So I paid him £1,700. It should have been £2,000, but New York Jumble was on the next day, this was on Saturday. And I said I could do it for him. I did. Anyway, I paid him £1,700. On the Monday or so, he rung me up again. He says, I've hit a problem. I'm drilling the oil waste, and the drills are running off. Oh, right. So I went over, and we sent the crankshafts through Staveley castings to Sheffield, and we got x-rayed, and they were full of holes, so scrap. So I had spent £2,500 nearly, and I had nothing to show for it. And £2,500 in 91, 92 was an awful lot of money. But anyway, we're still married after 43 years. But I got the monk on for about 10 years, till about 2002 or somewhere around there. And I thought,
hang on, let me give you some movies.
well, I'll look into this again. So I then went to Staveley Castings again, but I modified the wooden pattern. And I said, will you give it one more try? He says, all right, I'll get the best casters on it. But it didn't make the difference. First, they did an alloy one to test the alterations I'd made on it. So I bought that crankshaft back. They did it in alloy for 50 quid, and it's still in the garage now. Like. Anyway, and they did a steel one and had an x-ray, and it's still full of holes, and I thought, all right. So I rung a firm up at Sheffield, and I says, do you do fillet in EN16B? He says, yes. So they delivered it to Metal Box where I work. We made Quality Street tins and Celebration tins and all sorts. I was a die setter there after. I was a fitter at the pit for 20 years. And then went to there. So delivered to the security box, and 2 of us managed to lift it into the lathe. And I set it up. But I was a very good worker. I did a lot of home jobs. Right, so I covered myself with getting good production out. So the management were all right with me, like, and anyway, I knew the gaffer was going on holiday, so I got it in the lane and I started turning it. And that's where I did it, the whole crank. And then I chickened out of drilling the holes and put the splines on because I'd never used a dividing head on anything like. I was a fitter, not a tool maker, don't forget. You know, just going on a lathe or miller. I did it all in tech, surface grinders and things like. But anyway, I had that done and it cost me 300 quid. Nottingham, yeah, gags. You heard of gags? Tags. Tags or gags, I can't remember that.
Just
Well,
gags.
it was opposite there. They did the splines and they did the holes, right. So that was it. And in the meantime, don't forget, on that folders on the bench, there was 2 sets of crankcases, the Rocket 4 and the Quadrant. And anyway, so I built it up, sawed the pots off as you do, welded the crank, and it was all standard stuff where I had on the shelves, but they're not all good Trident stuff, you know, the barrel blown off on one side or stuff like that I used, and they were just standard barrels, but they're in tolerance, and that's still what's on there, because the engine has never actually been to pieces except for when I dropped it at Cadwell, and all the oil went through the clutch housing onto the clutch. I still went around the track doing 80s and whatever, slipping a bit. And anyway, when I got home, that's the only time I took the gearbox off, cleaned the sintered iron clutch plate when I put in, just in petrol, put it back on, it's still on now. And that's it. But, what else was I going to say? Yeah, but on this one, what people don't realise and all, I had to weld on the timing side casing. I had to weld on the inside to make room for the gear change, the crossover shaft, and then mill it out like to get it in. And then, because the main reason that I used the bondable frame is I already have tried an engine in it, like I thought. At the time, Les Williams was building the, what did you call it? Legends, and I couldn't get hold of a T160 frame. So I used this bunny, and it took me about 3 or 4 weeks to make the cradle, because it's an inch higher. I did it, what a job. But anyway, I did it. And I opened all the subframe out. I welded a different half of a swinging arm onto the existing one, you know, sawed one up and put the one with the bend on to bring the wheel over. I had to make longer studs for the back wheel to house it and all that.
When you come up and sorry Julian, when you come and have a look at the way the sprocket has gone, even with building a frame, like George did, he still had to space out the sprocket to get the chain run right, to get the engine virtually central in the frame. And one of the interesting things, sorry to go. One of the interesting things about the factory Quadrant and the Rocket 4 is anybody that rode that, and there's been various journalists that have ridden, certainly the factory bike, have always commented that although the bike looks lopsided, it doesn't ride lopsided, and probably the reason for that is a standard Trident. The actual primary drive on a standard Trident, the clutch basket, the shock absorb basket, the chain, the sprockets, it's nearly 1.5 stones, it's nearly 20 pounds. So a normal Trident engine tends to have a weight bias to the left hand side anyway. So effectively sticking a bit of alloy and a con rod and a piston on this side doesn't really make that much of a difference to the weight bias. But of course on George's bike you don't feel it at all because it's just the entire thing is centralised.
And another thing I didn't like, I mean I'd never actually seen the factory Quadrant when I built this. I knew it existed, I'd heard about it, but anyway, I didn't like how they got the gearbox inwards. I thought, well, it looks unfinished, it looks a bodge to me. So I can't remember 100% how I did it, but basically I used a Bonneville inner gearbox cover and married it up with a T160 outer cover to take it over, plus the round piece for the crossover shaft, where it goes on that side, I extended it a bit to try and complement things, and it just looks a lot better. Like, it's not doing anything, it's just cosmetic stuff, right? It looks a bit better.
It's like the centre pushrod tubes. The centre pushrod tubes have got nothing in them because the outer pushrod tubes each operate 2 valves, and so the centre pushrod tubes are just there to hide the gap.
Yeah.
I think your comment about, you know, the fact that it looks like a normal bike. I mean, I'm standing here and I've been looking at it all evening. It's just beautiful, and it's a compliment that it looks like a normal bike that you might walk past it in the street. It's just incredible.
Right. But the farthest I ever rode it, according to, I took it to France, I rode it in France with George Wozniak's Trident Rookie 3 Owners Club in France, like. And he says it's 144 kilometres. And somebody immediately got on the phone and says, oh, 88.8 miles, that's what we did, like. It was great. Other than that, I mean, I've really full bored it. Because just really thrashed hell out of it. The Cadwell, Anglesey, Mallory, the lot. You know, I didn't bother, like, I hadn't a clue what I just put petrol in, like. I'm just not interested. I'm not a data person.
I would imagine that I've probably done about the speedo stopped working for a while, but I reckon I've probably done 2,200 miles on it since I've had it. And my best guess is, if you was brave enough, and if it wasn't somebody else's bike, you've probably got a 140 mile an hour motorcycle there. At 80 miles, the revs, it does 3,000 at 50, 3.5 at 60, 4 at 70, 4.5 at 80, and there is no reason at all why it shouldn't go to 8,000. So you've got effectively another 60 miles an hour on from 80 miles an hour before effectively you hit the red line, and there is so much torque in the motor. When I was doing the final chunk of the run, we stopped for a hot chocolate because I was frozen to death at Gordino Services for Bristol. And I don't know whether any of you know, but when you come out of Gordino Services, there's a long climb up over the hill to get to where you drop down to Weston-super-Mare. And Dorian, who was following me in the van, we must have been doing about 70, and I went to pull over, to pull out to go past this lorry, and Dorian said, and all I did was I just rolled the throttle on, I didn't bother changing down, and Dorian said he just basically pulled away from me, and the bike didn't fluff in any way, shape or form, and it's quite a long haul that is, you know, and so to just be able to accelerate from like 17 miles an hour just up a hill, you wouldn't be able to do that on a car. You wouldn't be able to do it on even a 1,000cc Trident. You would need to go up and down the box. On this you don't. And as I say, a braver person than me, you've probably got a 140 mile an hour motorbike there. And that certainly in 1975 would have been the fastest bike on the road. Because this would have had development actually have properly gone on. This is what a Quadrant would have looked like in 1975. And of course that then provokes the question, well, would it have sold? And the only way I can answer that is the Honda CB750 as a consumer product was a much better consumer product than the Trident. But there was a marketplace for the Trident, and the T160 sold, everything that produced T160 sold. This would have inevitably, had this bike have appeared in 75, this would inevitably have been compared to the Z900, and this would have provided the same alternative to the Z900 as the T160 did to the CB750. So the probability is there would have been a market there for it. It would have been a connoisseur's motorcycle. The same people that bought Ducatis and Motor Guzzes with shit electrics in 1975 would have probably been in the market for this. I mean, I remember having mates who had Ducatis in 1975-76, and every time it rained, the bike stopped. But they're still sold. And I suspect this would have sold as an alternative to Z900. Not in the numbers Z900s did, but it would have sold.
One question, you mentioned obviously the Quadrent was based on the different chassis. Why didn't the factory use T100 chassis? It sits a lot better.
Because it was simply because the factory, it was just a development hack.
Yeah, but you thought just by looking at it, it would fit, the engine would fit a lot easier with a single down two frame.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's just that they'd started building it up from A75, and they'd got an A75 chassis there.
So I'm just wondering what happened if they had used the same chassis and developed it from there.
And they, of course, the Meriden making the Bonnevilles was a different company by then.
That's it. Yeah, that's probably why.
But at the same time, as John says, that I mean, not just because it's mine, because I've owned it and I've rode it on tracks, not a great distance and stuff like that, right? But at the same time, I think it would have been a really good seller on the American market. I mean, I'm only a little lad, and it was no bother to me, you know, 20 odd years ago. I mean, I'm 68 now, so, but you just did it. You won't bother, but as you get older, you probably notice it more like. But in them, they would love that.
I think we need to recognise that at the time we're talking about, the Commando was Bike of the Year for several years running, despite the fact that the Japanese were bringing out the likes of the 554 and the 754. My personal feeling, thinking back to that time, people were still buying Bonnevilles from Meriden. I think there would have been a market for it for a while. But the problem is, speaking like you as an accountant, you've only got to look at that specifically. It would have been horrendously expensive to build.
Well, they never could make a profit with the Trident.
Yeah.
And so they definitely wouldn't.
If they had the money to invest in that bike, but maybe with different crankcases, then I think it would have had a real future.
And I mean, it's a £40 cranky, finished crank. Well, I never weighed it when I first got the bed.
I haven't weighed this, but my best guess is it's approaching £600.
Yeah.
But my T150 is £600 with all the gear I've got on it, and this feels about the same weight. Now a standard T160 is £503. A standard T150 is £460. Not that I'm an average, but it's much heavier.
My question, and I think maybe we need to make this the last one, do we?
Yeah.
My question was going to be, I've had bitter experience of changing the exhaust on the 3-unit 650 and getting the carburation right, and it was a bitter and expensive experience. Got there, but again, going back to the fact that you designed effectively a new engine here, was the carburation fairly straightforward in that you just carbureted it to another cylinder, or did you have to tweak that?
Just, there was no bother at all. The only thing is, Les Williams gave me a bollock in it, casual, because I'd made my own inlet manifolds. Well, I'd made about 15 of them.
Yeah.
On night shift.
Do you know what I mean?
Why did you give
When
me
I turned the
bollock?
crank, the gaffers knew about it. Don't forget I'd worked down the pit and just gone to metal. Well, I'd been there a few years when I did that. But I did it on my own time. I mean, I had 14, 15 hours on Saturday nights and stuff like that. And I was on day shift. If I was on days, I'd be getting up at 5:15 in the morning. It worked for 6 o'clock. I'd go to bed, have a couple hours, go back to work at 6 o'clock till midnight or so, turn the crank, and stuff like that, and that's the only way I got it done.
One of the things that I think is probably relevant to the carburation and exhaust on this, when the Works triples came out, the and this just must be a feature of the way that the triumphs are, but when the Works Triples came out, they were effectively able to take the information that they'd learned from Percy Tate's 500 twins and just stick a cylinder on and replicate it.
Yeah.
Which is why I assume that George could take a 4-cylinder motorcycle, take the 3-cylinder settings and just add another one on, because you could do it from the 500 to the 750, so one assumes you can do it from the 750 to the... I don't know what the engineering reasons are, but I just know that they did it with the racing twins.
Yeah.
The racing bikes initially used exactly the same carburettors that the 500 twin used, but they used 3 of them instead of 2 of them, and therefore that's why I assume George was able to stick another carburettor on and just use the same settings.
Right, I say I only had to alter the gantry. I did it. But another thing, the reason this quadrant spelled with an E is, I mean, nowhere in the picture says you spelt it wrong. There's no way. But Jack Sheeman's come out with that. He says, why not call it quadrant with an E to go with Trident? And that's why
actually, there is one other thing that I forgot to mention. Seemingly an age ago now, I'm sure you'll think, but when I mentioned Norman Hunt's father created 3/6 camshafts, well, 6/6 camshafts. 2 went in the original quadrant. Well, 2 of the normal profile camshafts, unhardened, ended up in George's possession, and they ended up in this engine. So that's where George goes, his camshafts from.
well, what happened there is Ron Barrett, well, what's his name at National Motorcycle Museum? He put me on to it. I'd already drawn the camshafts out to then try and find some way to get them made. But he put me on to Ron Barrett. So I wrote Ron Barrett. He says, yes, I've got a set that were made by Rolf. Is it Rolf?
Yeah, Ray Hyde.
Ray Hyde, that's it. I used to call him Paul Hyde. Anyway, what happened was, he says, right, I've got a set. He says, they're yours. So I went down to Cheltenham Auto Jumble and paid £350 for it. He says they're ready to go in, but they weren't, because they didn't have a drive, you know, a quarter UNF threads in, or a drive for the rev guide. So I didn't want to disturb them with heating them up or anything, or welding on them, or whatever. So, I mean, it was 20 years ago, I think I pressed a piece in. And touch wood, that ignition screw's been in and out of there thousands of times when I first doing it. It's never shifted out. And I can't remember exactly how I did it. But that's how you go. But when I was putting the engine together, I don't know if I dropped the cam or it fell against the vice, and it seemed a bit tingy instead of like a door tap on that one. And I thought, something's not right here. So I took them to work. And on the Rockwell scale for hardening process, I mean that's an old scale now, I think, I don't know. I took a standard used Trident cam, and that was 40 Rockwell. And I took these cams, and they were 20, 25. So they hadn't been hardened. I was so lucky. They would have been flattened off by now. So I took them to Tamworth Heath treatment, because that's where I went to get the night tried it. And then, well, I rung Norman Hyde, and I said, the cams are soft, how do I get them hardened? He says, well, you want to, they'll heat them up for 90 hours, or they'll heat them up and then they'll cool them controlled for 90 hours till they're done, and they'll not disturb or anything. And that's what I did. I took down with heat treatment, and that's what they did. So we're on again then. Yeah.
Right. I think we'll round it up now. Big thank you to John and George turning up now for bringing us home motorcycle. Big deep, please. for a lovely charity as well. Which would be much appreciated. There'll be sandwiches at the bar for anyone who wants to help themselves.